Senior Vice President and past President of the British Entomological and Natural History Society. The Society, which will celebrate its 150th anniversary next year, is always keen to welcome new members. So if you're not a member already, have a look at our website, benhs.org.uk, where you can find out more about the Society and the benefits of membership. On behalf of BENHS, I'd like to thank Kieran and his colleagues at FSC Biolinks for hosting today's presentation. It's the third in a series of entomology-focused natural history live events this year that feature a BENHS guest speaker. Many of these jointly badged and promoted talks were originally scheduled for the 2020 BENHS Annual Meeting and Members Day at Oxford University Museum of Natural History, a meeting which, like so many others, had to be postponed because of COVID. And so to today's presentation. I'm delighted that Marcus Rhodes agreed to deliver his deferred talk, Some Like It Hot, Butterflies in a Changing Climate, in this format. Marcus is an ecologist with a background, first degree at Cambridge and then master's at Imperial. And the fascinating topic he's going to be sharing with us today will reflect the research he's been undertaking for his PhD at the University of Exeter. Research which has enabled him to continue his interest in the response of insects to habitat and climate change with his love of butterflies. So, ladies and gentlemen, Marcus Rhodes.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian, and thank you for the invitation to talk today. I'm rather blown away actually by the number of people that have turned up. So it's fantastic to see you all. So yeah, as Ian says, today I'm going to be talking a little bit about how butterflies in the UK are responding to climate and some of the kind of lessons that we can learn from this. I'll start off by talking a little bit about how some species respond to climate. Before then, I'll say a bit about microclimate, how we, what it is, how we measure it, and why it's important to butterflies. Before then, talking a bit about how butterflies can use microclimate to thermoregulate. And then just before we finish, I'm going to touch a little bit on some of the field work that I'm currently doing, looking at silver-studded blues on the mine sites down here in Cornwall, and how sort of in a changing climate we can think about conserving butterflies. So first of all, why butterflies? So why are we interested in studying butterflies in the context of climate change? And first of all, so butterflies, like most insects, are ectothermic. So they're cold-blooded. So their physiology and behavior is very closely governed by environmental temperatures. And they also have very short life cycles. So a lot of these kind of effects of climates very rapidly kind of translate through into population level effects that we can study. And so consequently, so butterflies respond very rapidly to climate change, and particularly, butterfly populations often vary from year to year, vary quite dramatically as a result of changes in weather conditions, for instance. And importantly, particularly here in the UK, butterflies are very well recorded. So the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, run by Butterfly Conservation, has been going since 1976, I think. So it's almost 45 years of continuous data, and we have a large army of volunteers across the UK, myself included, going out and collecting this data. So there's a lot of really nice data sets for studying species responses to climate change. And some particularly kind of striking examples and how species are affected by climate change can be seen in changes in distribution amongst our butterflies. So the figure you can see on the left here, this is from the State of the UK Butterflies report published by Butterfly Conservation and the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And this is showing changes in the distribution of the common butterfly, probably a species most of you are very familiar with. It's a widespread garden butterfly species, but it's showing its change in distribution in the UK over the last 40 years or so. So you can see the dark dots down here. This was the distribution in the 1970s. And then the orange dots are sort of the 2010 to 2014. And you can see this species has had a really quite dramatic shift northwards in its range, which appears to be climate driven. Similarly, this is another species. So speckled wood has undergone a similar range expansion northwards, again, largely confined to the south of the UK, and also there's refugial populations up in the Great Glen as well. But in recent decades, it's expanded out from those to colonize certainly most of England, and increasingly parts of the Highlands as well. And I mean, there are quite a few examples of this with species expanding their ranges, but here's a particularly nice example in the form of the brown argus, which, so the kind of historic distribution of this butterfly was largely confined to chalk and limestone grasslands historically. And there's some quite nice research being done on this by Pateman et al., showing that this species range expansion appears to be largely driven by changes in its diet or the host plants that it's using as a result of climate change. So historically, most populations have been feeding on rock rose, which is a species of chalk and limestone grasslands. And so the little map you can see on the left here, so the dark blue and red dots you can see, these are the historic distribution of the butterfly in the 1970s and 80s. And then the pale dots, they are the distribution during the 1990s and early 2000s. And the red dots are the populations that there were sites where the butterfly is feeding on rock rose, and the blue sites are where it's feeding on geranium. And so, as hopefully you can see, historically, most of the colonies were feeding on rock rose. But as figure B shows, with as time has progressed, in recent decades, the fraction of colonies which are feeding on geranium, which is what this graph here is showing, has substantially increased. And if we look at the figure on the far right here, so this is annual summer temperature. And so you can see that the recent increase in summer temperature as a result of climate change. And then at the bottom here, so the open circles, this is how well, or the rate of population growth on colonies that feed either on geranium compared to rock rose. So if it's below zero here, the colonies they do relatively less, or they do worse on geranium compared to rock rose. But you can see in recent years, correlated with this rise in summer temperature, the geranium has become increasingly a more suitable host plant for this butterfly. And this really appears to be what's driving the range expansion in this particular species. Geranium is much more widespread species, and hence it's able to sort of spread off these chalk grassland sites. So those are some of the species that are doing quite well currently as a result of climate change. But we also have species that are negatively affected from climate change. So this here is the mountain ringlet, which is our only montane species of butterfly in the UK. So it's found at sites above 250 meters or so in the Lake District and Scottish Highlands. And the graph you can see on the left here was a study by Aldina Franco and colleagues. So they visited sites for which there were historic records of mountain ringlet in the 1970s to the late 1990s. So they revisited these sites in 2004, 2005 to see whether or not the butterfly is still present. And hopefully, as you can quite clearly see, this butterfly appears to be retreating uphill as a result of climate change. So these are the percentage of sites that were extinct in various kind of elevational bands across the species distribution. And the vast majority of extinctions, so 75% of colonies at the lowest elevational bands have gone extinct. And some species are also, as well as retreating uphill, they can also retreat northwards. So this is still part of the same study. So these are two of our northernly distributed species, so the northern brown argus and the Scotch argus. And similarly, when these were revisited in the early 2000s, Aldina and her colleagues found that so the lower elevation, the lower latitudinal sites, so those towards the southern edge of its range in the UK, have disproportionately shown more, or have had more extinctions taking place. So those are some of the kind of very clear kind of trends in range shifts that we're seeing, but also another very striking result of climate change has been changes in phonology. So this is a paper by Callum McGregor et al. And published a couple of years ago, looking at shifts in phonology of various UK Lepidoptera species through time. And this is a figure from that paper which is showing two two species. So on the left, you've got silver-studded blue, and on the right, we have the small blue. And as you can hopefully see from these graphs here, so this is the day of the year, and this is through time, day of year the butterfly has reached peak emergence. And through time, hopefully you can see that this is so decreasing. In other words, the butterflies, both these species are emerging earlier as kind of in recent decades than they were in previous decades. And this kind of has quite interesting implications for butterflies. So this paper actually then looked at the effect that this has on butterflies' abundance, and particularly looking at changes in, or looking at the phonology, so the kind of whether the species has one or two life cycles each year. So silver-studded blue produces a single generation each year, whereas, so it's what we would call univoltine, whereas small blue produces 2 generations, so it's a bivoltine or multivoltine species. And looking across a wide range of Lepidoptera species, this study found that so species that only have a single generation, emerging earlier in the year, tends to have either a neutral, or in this case with silver-studded blue, actually a slight negative effect on their abundance. Whereas for multivoltine species, like the small blue, we're actually seeing emerging earlier in the year allows increases in population growth rates. And this appears to be basically emerging earlier in the year, particularly the second or later generations in the year, they have more of a chance to increase. So you can get these kind of additive effects of increased population growth rates. So interestingly, phonology has quite an, it can have, there are winners and losers amongst our butterfly faunas, which potentially is linked to their life cycle. And this is quite a nice example of potentially a species that's losing out as a result of its phonology. So this is the wall brown, which is, well, formerly was quite a widespread species across the UK. But as hopefully you can see from this figure here, so this comes again from the State of the UK's Butterfly Report. So these blue circles and crosses, this is where it has gone extinct. And so it's disappeared from across large parts of inland central southern England. And there's a number of possible causes of this, but one of them potentially is a role of climate change. And so, I mean, this is a sort of study from a Dutch group led by Van Dijk et al., looking at how the kind of the life cycle of the wall brown potentially has implications for its decline. So historically in the UK and also in Belgium, the wall brown has had 2 generations each year. So it produces one in about now, so late April, early May, and then the second generation in August. And then the larvae of the second generation overwinter to then emerge the next spring. But with climate change, increasingly, this species appears to be trying to squeeze in a 3rd generation. So obviously it's emerging earlier in the year, and it's also the development time of its caterpillars have decreased with temperature. And so rather than overwintering as a caterpillar here, it tries to squeeze in a 2nd generation. And this can potentially lead to developmental traps. So this 3rd generation the offspring of which doesn't actually have time to produce enough or to develop fast enough in order to survive the winter. So the caterpillar has to reach a specific stage of its life cycle, so the 3rd instar, in order to overwinter. Otherwise, it's liable to be killed by frost. And so in this case, we seem to have an example of a species that emerging earlier in the year and trying to squeeze in an extra generation is actually driving population declines. And so in the UK and also in Belgium, it's only at the coastal sites, which have relatively cool summer temperatures, that it's the majority of the individuals aren't trying to produce this 3rd generation, and hence this population hasn't collapsed. And this is quite a nice kind of modeled example of this from the United States on a species called the mustard white. And so here the authors have modeled development of caterpillars as a result of temperature, and they produce these spatial maps predicting how many generations the butterfly is likely to produce each year. And hopefully, as you can see, so since the 1980s, the number of individuals producing 4 generations a year has increased. And they've also then been able to model whether or not this 4th generation is likely to fall into one of these developmental traps. And then the impact that that has on population growth rates. And if you kind of, if you say focus on this area here, you can see, so where butterflies have been able to produce 4 successful generations a year without falling into a trap, they've really been able to cash in on climate change and, have increased the population growth rates as a result. But clearly, if you do fall into this trap, then the development has been, or if you fall into a trap, then you're unlikely, that has knock-on effects of population growth rates, and hence, got very low growth rates in these areas. So hopefully this kind of demonstrates that, there's quite a wide range of varied responses, both in distribution and phonology amongst butterflies as a result of climate change. And consequently, there's both winners and losers. So I just want to talk a little bit now about microclimate and its importance for butterflies. So I think it's important to realize that when we talk about climate, we often tend to think about climate as it's measured by a weather station. So weather stations record average climatic conditions across large areas, typically tens or hundreds of square kilometers, which kind of makes sense, because if you're trying to forecast weather conditions, you want that to apply for as large an area as possible. But it's important to realize that that's very different to the climatic conditions that are actually experienced by a small organism such as an insect on the ground. So close to the ground, vegetation and topography modify the effects of climate to produce fine-scale variation in climate that we call microclimates. And this is quite nicely demonstrated with this thermal image here. This was taken back in the autumn last year, and on this particular day, ambient air temperature, as would be measured by a weather station, was 17 degrees Celsius. But as you can hopefully see from this image, if we actually look at the surface temperatures down in the vegetation where many insects are occurring, there's actually a very wide range of temperatures available, which actually bear very little resemblance to the ambient air temperature. So this is just a kind of an area of rough grassland, and if you focus in on this, there's this little bare patch of bare ground in the foreground. You can see here that temperatures are actually in excess of 30 degrees. So clearly then, if you kind of imagine yourself as a caterpillar, say sat on the edge of this bare patch, the climatic conditions that you're actually experiencing are very different to the kind of weather condition or the kind of weather station climatic conditions that we often have historically been using to try and predict species to climate change. Also, if this starts getting a bit too hot for you, for example, this kind of variation in temperature within a very small area of land actually kind of creates various possibilities for regulating your body temperature. You could potentially just move to a slightly shadier patch here, and that, potentially you're looking at an almost 10-degree drop in temperature. So if we want to try and understand how species are responding to climate change, we really actually need to be able to model or understand temperatures at a scale, a spatial scale, physiologically relevant to butterflies and other insects. And one of the reasons that this is important is that there's growing evidence that actually this kind of variation in microclimate has quite important consequences for species extinction risk under climate change. So I've just included a few. You can see things like extinction risk from climate change is reduced by microclimate buffering, and microclimate affects landscape persistence of British Lepidoptera. So in some of these studies are increasingly finding that areas that have very variable microclimate, species that are threatened with climate change are actually far more likely to persist than in areas, say, much more topographically flat areas where the climate is less variable. So there's, I guess in the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot of growing interest in trying to understand climate responses using microclimate. And that's been facilitated through advances both in modeling techniques and remote sensing. So as I've mentioned, microclimate is largely driven by topography and vegetation. And with the recent advances in remote sensing, we can actually capture this kind of data across large areas and use it to make predictions about the climate conditions that something like a butterfly would be experiencing. So one technique is the use of LiDAR. So LiDAR is, you can use a plane, you fly over the area, and you essentially send down pulses of lasers and then measure the waveform that's reflected back off the ground to the aeroplane. And from this, we can get very detailed three-dimensional structure of topography and vegetation height, because it's also able to kind of penetrate through the canopy, through canopy gaps as well. So you can get kind of a vertical structure of vegetation that we can use to model microclimate. This is an example of some LiDAR data here of one of my field sites, wheel made. And also increasingly with drone technology now, we can get, even higher spatial resolution. This is my colleague, Robin Curtis, who works in both marsh fritillaries here in Cornwall and Glanville fritillaries on the Isle of Wight. And Robin is he's a qualified drone pilot. And so he's using a technique here called structure for motion photogrammetry. So he's flying a drone over his study site and taking lots of pictures, and then by looking at how the distance and perspective of these images differs from location to location as the drone moves, you can actually build up a three-dimensional structure of your site. And because drones fly very, very low altitudes, you can get really phenomenal detail from this. So this particular example you can see here, I think is at 2 centimeter spatial resolution, mapping the sites. So using topographic data on vegetation structure and topography, and also we can also use aerial photographs to look at reflectance of vegetation to calculate things like the canopy cover. So we can take conventional weather station data and we can downscale that to very fine scales, as this kind of figure is trying to demonstrate here. So if you imagine, so A here, we've got a typical Met Office weather station data set for the UK. This is gridded at 5 kilometer spatial resolution. And then we can, using microclimate models and our kind of information about structure, we can downscale to produce very fine detailed predictions of air temperatures close to the ground. So this figure B here, I think is at I think it's 100 meter spatial resolution, so what we might think of as mesoclimate. And then figure C, this is at 1 meter spatial resolution, and D here, this is the air temperatures at 2 centimeter spatial resolution here. So you can think of this almost like a really accurate or very precise weather forecast. So we can predict the exact air temperatures of each square centimeter of land, and really kind of nail down climate conditions to the scale at which insects are experiencing it. And we're very powerful for studying species responses to climate change. So, this is quite a nice example here this is some work done by my supervisor, John Benny, and this is looking at range expansion of the silver-spotted skipper, which is this species here. So this is a species that's it's right on the kind of northwestern edge of its range globally here in the UK. And it's restricted historically, at least, to short grasslands in southeast England, and typically to the south-facing slopes. And so this species, it appears to be that air temperature during the adult flight season in August is particularly important for determining the climate suitability of sites for the species. They really need air temperatures to be above about 25 degrees in order to lay their eggs. Below that temperature, the adults aren't really active enough. And so the modeling here that John has used is, so these are all habitat patches of short grassland across the South Downs. Eastbourne's just off the edge of the image here. And so he's calculated the number of hours at which temperatures exceed that critical threshold of 25 degrees. So this is historic data in 1982, and the bold areas are sites that are occupied by silver-spotted skipper. So as you can hopefully see historically here, you know, this was really the only site that was occupied, these two here, and they have, you know, particularly high, they're very hot sites within the landscape. But increasingly with global warming, many more of these sites now have reached temperatures, you know, where they exceed 25 degrees, and consequently this butterfly has spread out in the landscape. And increasingly, so these formerly, it was restricted, as I said, to south-facing slopes, but increasingly it's also moving around onto west-facing sites. So, and if you would compare the prediction of site suitability to conventional climate models, we've been able to show that so these microclimate models are actually significantly better at predicting how species are expanding their range in response to climate change. So hopefully that kind of demonstrates that being able to model microclimate is really, it's really a kind of game changer in our ability to understand species responses to climate. So I just want to talk a little bit now about thermoregulation and the actual mechanisms by which butterflies use microclimate to regulate their body temperatures, because it's something that I've been working on recently. So if we kind of look at this, this thermal image, this is of a speckled wood. As I'm sure many of you know, butterflies, you often see them when they're on cold days, they're out basking. So as well as being able to pick, you know, suitable microclimates in which to live, they also have a fair degree of control over their body temperature due to behavioral responses by, you know, angling their wings towards the sun. And as you can see from this image here, so this speckled wood is able to raise its body temperature significantly above that of the vegetation surrounding it through its, you know, basking posture. And the graphs on the right here, so this was a really nice study that came out by Andrew Bladen and his colleagues at Cambridge last year, looking at, well, they compared a wide range of species in the UK and looked at their ability to regulate their body temperatures. So on the y-axis here, we have the thoracic temperature of butterflies. So they would catch butterflies in a net and using a fine wire thermocouple, take a measurement of the body temperature. And then on the y-axis here, we have the ambient air temperature. And as you can hopefully see, they found quite an interesting and wide range of responses between different species and their abilities to regulate temperature. So something like a large white, as this example shows here, at low temperatures is actually really quite good at raising its body temperature, you know, a full sort of 10 degrees or so above that of the ambient air. And also slope, so the slope here is less than 1:1, which is the solid line. So actually over a wide range of temperatures, the large white is able to maintain quite stable body temperatures. So it can kind of maintain its body temperature within the sort of optimum of, they usually need to be about over 30 degrees or so to take off. And similarly, the silver-spotted skipper also kind of responds in a similar way. But other species, if we look at, for instance, the small heath here, these species actually aren't very good at, you know, differentiating their body temperature from air temperature. And actually, you know, small heath here is very closely tracking air temperature across a wide range of temperatures. And similarly, mountain ringlet, as you might expect for a cold adapted butterfly, while very good at raising body temperatures above that of ambient, again, it appears to have very little control over body temperature. And the kind of the sort of slope is very similar to a one-to-one relationship. So this was a really nice study and kind of provided inspiration for some of the modeling that I've been working on in the recent months. So I'm quite interested to understand the mechanisms as to why different species appear to be responding differently in their abilities to regulate body temperature. And if we think a little bit about the underlying physics behind this, so if you imagine you have a butterfly basking, so that butterfly is going to be receiving radiation from the sun, which will heat it up. And that, depending on the weather conditions, will either direct solar radiation, it's a nice clear day, or if it's cloudy, then that radiation gets scattered in the cloud, and so it comes in the form of diffuse radiation. And so some of that radiation that falls on the butterfly, some of it will be absorbed, raising the butterfly's temperature, and some of it will be reflected. And similarly, radiation is also reflected off the substrate around the butterfly, some of which will also be absorbed by the butterfly. But at the same time as receiving radiation from their environment, butterflies are also losing heat through radiation, and this is in the form of long-wave thermal radiation. So this is what a thermal imaging camera is measuring, and the emission of thermal long-wave radiation is proportional to the temperature of the object to the power of 4. So the butterfly is losing heat through thermal radiation, and also all the objects around the butterfly are also going to be radiating long-wave radiation, so rocks and also the cloud cover as well. So you've got this kind of energy budget of radiation that will influence the butterfly's temperature. But of course, radiation isn't the only heat transfer process. So butterflies are also, if they're in contact with the substrate, will be losing heat through conduction. There's also potential for latent heat loss as a result of evaporation. Now, that's not a particularly important heat loss pathway for butterflies, but in something like mammals, like ourselves that sweat, it can be a very important way of losing heat. But more importantly, you also have convection as a major pathway for losing heat. And that can either be free convection, where you have circulation of air as a result of changes in buoyancy, as a result of expansion due to heating or cooling. But more importantly, usually in the outdoor environment, you have forced convection, which is in the form of wind. So this is where you have movement of air driven by pressure differences. And so in most cases, for a butterfly outside, forced convection is the main convective heat loss pathway that's operating. So all of these different kind of pathways of heat loss are actually already accounted for in the microclimate models that we can use to predict air temperatures. So it's actually really only a kind of the next step on to put the butterfly into the equation and predict the temperatures that a butterfly can, reach when it's basking. You need to know a little bit about the thermal properties of a butterfly. But so in the last few months, really, I've been working on a thermal model looking at how butterflies or look at the temperatures that a basking butterfly could potentially reach in the environment, which I just want to kind of show a little sneak preview of now. So this is looking at the radiation part of the model for the butterfly. And this happened to be using a large white here as the example, and modeling how radiation is absorbed across the butterfly. And this is kind of based on a previous study by my colleague Katie Shanks, who was actually looking at how butterflies use their wings to bask. Katie's actually she's a solar engineer, so she's been looking at large whites as kind of inspiration for building solar concentrators for the solar industry. But the underlying physics is really quite interesting for this species, because you might have noticed that large whites, they don't tend to bask with their wings flat, but they're usually in this kind of V-like position that you can see here. And that's because most of our whites are what we call reflective baskers. So their wings are they're highly reflective to radiation. And so by angling the wings in a V like this, they can actually bounce the sun onto their thorax, which you might notice is very dark. So it has a high absorption to radiation. And in doing so, they're able to capture sunlight across their wing and concentrate that onto the thorax, which is why whites are usually the very first species to take to the wing on a cloudy day. It's because they're able to heat up much faster than many other species. And so the graph you can see here, so this is a kind of a prototype of the radiation model that I've been working on. And as you can see that, it's a bit rough and ready still at present, but it quite nicely captures this relationship, and that you can see, so this is the absorbed radiation so the red line is across the whole butterfly and the black line is just the thorax. And you can see that around 50 degrees wing angle is when they kind of maximize capture of radiation. And that's the kind of solar concentrating effect caused by the wing. So ultimately, once we've got this fully up and running, the plan is to use it to actually produce predictive maps of the potential body temperatures that a butterfly can achieve across the landscape. So I just want to kind of slightly change track now, very briefly talk a little bit about some of the field work that I've been doing, looking at microclimate and butterflies, in particularly reference to the silver-studded blues on Cornish mining sites here in Cornwall. So Cornwall, as you may know, has quite a long heritage or history and heritage of mining in the county. And this has left us with a number of these old mining sites, which are of really quite interesting and important conservation value. So this is one of the field sites that I work on. This is Wheel Maid in Gwennet Parish, which, well, back in the day, this was actually one of the largest copper mines in the world. Gwennet Parish was known as the richest square mile on earth. And these sites now are kind of, they're derelict brownfield sites, but they've developed a really kind of interesting flora and fauna, and so, have really quite high conservation value. So quite a wide range of butterfly species can be found on these sites, such as grayling, green hairstreak and dingy skipper. You've also got things like small pearl-bordered fritillary and wall on these sites. And of course, my study species, the silver-studded blue. And so as hopefully you can see from this image, these sites are really nice kind of systems for studying the effect of microclimate, because they have very variable vegetation and topography. And particularly, they have a lot of bare ground. And this is actually a legacy of the mining, or the pollution from mining at these sites. So these sites have a lot of heavy metal and arsenic in the soils. So actually arsenic was another major mineral that was mined from these sites, and that suppresses vegetation growth. So you've got a lot of bare ground and short vegetation, creating very hot microclimates that a lot of these species on these sites depend upon. So as I said, I've been studying the silver-studded blue at these sites, which is a species that's known to rely on short vegetation and hot microclimates. So it's a very nice model system for looking at how microclimate affects butterfly distribution. So for the last 2 years, I have been mapping silver-studded blue distribution across the network of mine sites. So this is the Carnham Valley mine site, which is the habitat network I'm working in. Just to kind of give you some bearings, so this is Truro at the top here, and we've got Redruth in the far corner here, and this is down to Deveron, which that's Restronge Creek, which flows into the Fowl, the area. So each year I've been walking transects across these sites, and I'll be doing that again this summer, mapping the distribution of silver-studded blue populations. And this is some data from 2019. And as you can hopefully see, the butterflies got quite a widespread but patchy distribution across these sites, forming quite discrete colonies. So my PhD is really looking at how microclimate variation across these sites how it influences the distribution of the butterfly and the colonization and extinction from year to year at different sites. And I've also, this spring, I've also started looking at the larval stages as well, and their fine scale use of microclimate in the landscape. So actually how they can use, within the space of a few meters, changes in temperature to regulate their body temperature. And so, yeah, so earlier this week, I was out with my supervisor, Adrian Spalding, and we found 3 of these silver-studded blue caterpillars. And this is the ant you can see here is Lasius niger. So this species is an obligate mutualist of Lasius ants. The caterpillars actually live in and around the ant nests and are kind of guarded and tended by these ants. And so my project is looking at the thermal requirements of the butterfly and also the ants to try and understand how that influences their presence and absence. So that's just this is kind of ongoing work. I don't have research at present, results at present to show you, but I just wanted to kind of give you a bit of a sneak peek of what I've been getting up to. And then just to kind of wrap up, because I'm conscious we are rapidly running out of time, just wanted to say a little bit about how we go about conserving species under changing climates. So as I've kind of alluded to, there are species that are potentially benefiting from climate change, and there are also losers, that are not doing so well as a result of changes in temperature and also things like precipitation. So some of the key messages really, first of all, is that existing habitat patches are still really important, even in under a situation of climate change. And it's quite an old study, still very pertinent. So although we might expect the majority of butterfly species to respond positively to increasing temperatures, actually about 2/3 or 3/4 even of our butterfly species are currently in decline. And that's largely driven by changes in habitat. So any kind of positive benefits that climate change may be bringing to the UK's butterfly fauna is actually, for many species, being offset by loss of habitat. So really, it's important to conserve and expand existing habitat networks as well, to try and give existing populations the best chance they have. Kind of second to that, also, connectivity is really important. So if we're trying to, species are going to have to shift their ranges in response to climate change, but that's greatly hindered if you have highly fragmented habitats. And this is quite a nice study by Jane Hill and colleagues. So looking at the range expansion in the speckled wood, which is one of the species featured at the beginning of this talk, and showing that basically where you have less habitat, so in regions that had lower woodland cover, the rate of expansion for species has been slower. So actually connecting up, so expanding and connecting up habitats is really important to facilitate range shifts. But what about those species that are perhaps less mobile and can't move in response to climate change? Well, as hopefully some of what I was telling you about microclimate can indicate, there is potentially some scope for using microclimate heterogeneity, so variation in microclimates, to allow species to persist in situ at sites. And although, so I've said many species, well, in the UK, most of our butterfly fauna will probably benefit from climate. It's worth pointing out, or increases in temperature, it's worth pointing out that temperatures by no means the only response to climate change. And actually, as this study by Oliver et al. Shows, many of our species, even species such as speckled wood that potentially benefit from increasing temperatures, are actually changes in precipitation can have pretty negative effects. So this is actually looking at how species responded to the 1995 drought. And the graphs here actually, so this graph here shows responses of speckled wood and how the population actually following that drought has really quite, dramatically collapsed. And they identified actually a range of, really quite widespread and common species that they reckon are very highly drought threatened. And these extreme weather events and droughts are increasingly becoming more likely. So conservation in situ is going to be important for many species, but we can potentially use microclimate variation to an advantage, either by identifying sites that are particularly diverse in their microclimates and targeting those for conservation. So identifying potential, what you might call climate refugia, so places where species are going to be able to persist in future, but also potentially through management. This hasn't been explored particularly very much, but looking at how species, how you could manage sites to, say, for instance, changes in vegetation or increasing topography even, to actually change heterogeneity and allow species to persist in situ. And finally, just to say there is also the possibility of moving species through assisted colonization. This is a controversial topic, but previous studies, this is a study by Willis et al. So the two species, marble white and silver-spotted skipper, as a kind of proof of principle, they translocated colonies beyond the northern range of its current distribution, but to sites that were identified as being climatically suitable, and showed that both of these colonies was quite successful and perturbed. So just to kind of conclude, hopefully kind of give you a bit of flavor of some of the research surrounding butterflies and microclimate, and the effects that climate change, the effects are already being felt in our butterfly fauna. Microclimate variation and behavioral thermoregulation potentially can offer some capacity to buffer some of those impacts, but going forward, there will increasingly be needs for adaptive management and conservation. And just to say thank you to my supervisors, so Richard French-Constant, Gillian McLean, John Benny, and Adrian Spalding, various other people like Keith Wilson, Robin Curtis, James Duffy, and Sally Foster, who have helped enormously with this project. And to my sponsors, Cornwall Butterfly and Moth Society, the University of Exeter, and Spalding Associates. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, we had a hand up from Oliver, but it's disappeared. So I'm not sure if that was an accident, but if anybody would like to ask a question in person, if they could raise their hands, that would be great. In the meantime, Emma, I'm going to come to you. We've only got time for a few questions. So if you want your question asked, you really need to raise your hand if you want to make sure it's asked. Emma, can we have a first question from the chat?
Yeah, the first question I'd like to ask is there evidence that species that benefit from increased temperatures becoming extinct in the southern limit of their range?
Yes, yeah, there is. And actually, in the kind of, if you take the UK as an example, so species like mountain ringlet and Scotch Argus, northern brown Argus, those species I showed at the start. So they are at the southern range limits. So they're essentially they're Arctic alpine species. So they reach their southern latitudinal or elevational range limits in the UK. And increasingly, those species appear to be moving uphill. So the lower elevational latitudinal colonies are going extinct. So yeah, potentially, I mean, how much further they can move north depends very much on, whether, how far up mountains they can move, or certainly in the Lake District, it's possible that some of the mountain ringlet colonies might actually disappear from there if they run out of mountain to move northwards. But yeah, certainly at the southern range margin, species are disappearing. It just so happens that the UK is, because of where we sit in Europe, most species are at the northwestern limits of their range, and hence in this country, most species are benefiting from increased temperature.
Thanks, Marcus. Joy, would you like to ask your question?
Hello, Marcus.
Hello.
Butterflies aren't my area of expertise, and this isn't your work. This is something you referred to at the beginning of your talk. I was interested in that you talked about a 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature being significant in terms of the brown Argus distribution. Is that a significant effect? Sorry, my phone's ringing. Excuse me.
Yes, so the brown Argus has really quite dramatically expanded its range. I think it's reached about as far as possibly Durham, I think now. And that does appear to be largely temperature driven as a result of facilitated changes in diet, and the fact that it's able to shift to a new host plant that, as temperatures have warmed, have become increasingly more thermally suitable for the butterfly. And there's been quite a lot of kind of rearing and lab experiments actually done here at Exeter looking at the responses of this species to changes in climate.
I think we've probably just got time for 2 more questions. So I'm going to go to the 2 people that raised their hand in order for that. So Angela, what's your question?
Hello, Marcus. With the change in climate to sort of warmer temperatures, are we going to expect to see colonization from continental butterflies in increasing numbers? And which species do you think are most likely to come over?
Yes, is the answer. I mean, it in part largely depends on which species can actually make it across the channel. So obviously on continental Europe, movement is less restricted, but there are certainly, species that in recent years have started colonizing and breeding. So the continental race of the swallowtail has quite regularly in recent years bred in the south. We've had long-tail blue is another species that's increasingly being seen in the UK. That's a migratory species.
Yeah.
But I had one down here in Cornwall actually 2 years ago now, which was nice. And species like Queen of Spain fritillary, again, is, they're on the dunes just the other side of the channel. And increasingly we've had breeding attempts in the UK. None of those species, so far as I'm aware to date, have actually permanently established, but they very much look poised to in the near future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Brilliant question. Sue, would you like to ask yours?
Yeah, when you have an increase in the number of generations that species are managing to get through in a year, is there any evidence? I hear what you're saying about some not completing a generation, then that's a big problem. But is there any evidence that a speeding up of these life cycles is leading to less viable individuals? Are they coming out smaller and thinner or something like that?
Yeah, I'm not actually sure the effects on body size of developmental time. I mean, caterpillars, the body temperature of these caterpillars being ectothermic ultimately depend, a lot of their physiological processes are dependent on that. So with increased temperature, development increases, but whether or not, I'm not sure that necessarily translates into smaller individuals. But generally, most of the effects of increased development appears to be beneficial, because also you've got costs of, and when you're a caterpillar, you're very vulnerable to predation. So actually, if you've got a shorter caterpillar stage, often your parasitism or predation risks are lower. But yeah, I'm not sure actually on body size. Certainly drought, the effects of drought has major effects on body size. You often get very small individuals in drought years because the food plants shrivel up and starvation is a problem. Yeah, I'm not sure about development rate.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm just aware of time. So what I might ask is, Emma, have you got a quick question? Or if you've got one or two very, very quick questions that are 1 or 2 word answers, we can put Marcus on the spot.
Okay, there was one that asked, where do butterflies go and what do they do when it's cold and cloudy?
So they generally just sit very miserable in the vegetation. So they, you'll often find butterflies actually on cold days. They'll just be kind of, so silver-studded blue roosts down in the heather. You'll see them sort of sat in heather or marram grass at the dunes, and they're all just kind of sat there waiting for the sun to emerge. And particularly if it's rainy, I think you can often get quite high mortality in rainy conditions because they're often just sat out in the open. I guess they must be pretty high risk, for predation as well when they're like that. But yeah, they just really have to sit it out. I mean, they can sit it out for quite a long time, again, because metabolism slows down at lower temperatures, so they can go without feeding in the cold conditions.
Okay, and one more question from the chat. Is there any evidence of milder winters helping fewer butterflies be killed as they overwinter?
So actually so it's something I didn't touch on, but milder and particularly wetter winters is actually generally negatively associated with most butterfly species. Generally thought because of pathogens, particularly fungal pathogens, are much more prevalent during wetter conditions. So you actually get higher mortality of the overwintering stages. Potentially also, if you get hot days during the winter, encouraging species to come out when there aren't plants to feed, flowering plants to feed on, they're also potentially wasting energy doing that. So generally, actually, butterflies like really cold winter conditions. So hot summers, but cold winters tend to be best for most species.
Okay, thank you very much, Marcus, for absolutely thrilling talk.